go
Move
further?
just this side.
This side of
Yeah.
this one? Okay.
Yeah, is that working?
Yeah. Okay, so this presentation was actually made in 2007, 2008, and I just did a tiny wee bit of updating on it. So I didn't have time to do anything else. So I'm going to use it as kind of the structure of what I'm talking to you about, but at any time that you have a question, go ahead and ask, and if it's something I'm going to address later on, I'll just tell you that. We'll talk about it later, and otherwise I'll respond to it right away. So the reason we chose this title is because up until the 20th century, everybody took care of their own dead at home, or at least within their community. And things were done more naturally. There was no embalming, there was no concrete vaults, there was all of that kind of stuff, right? It just didn't exist. So that's what we're trying to do, is to go back to that form of caring for our dead, because we lost so much in the 20th century with it all being sort of displaced to the funeral industry. So some unfamiliar words, or words you might be wondering what they mean: planned death. That is, before, during, after. It can go as early as advanced care planning. It can go as late as, possibly several years after the death, the family getting together to spread the ashes or to plant flowers on the grave or whatever. Death journeyer is the person who's actually experiencing all of this, and that's because we want to acknowledge that dying isn't a medical issue, and it isn't something that just happens. It's a journey, and there's an intense journey that's going on inside the dying person when they're, even when they're in what appears to be a coma. In fact, there's this internal processing that is going on as they prepare for death. A death midwife is somebody who supports the family all the way through that process. So for example, I might start with the person or the couple with their advanced care planning, and several years later one of them is terminal, and then start working with them through the pre-death and through the home funeral, and we'll get to what that is, and whatever funeral or memorial ceremonies they want, and extending out to first year anniversary, or even, as I said, a couple of years later, spreading ashes or doing something with the grave. When we use the word family, we mean chosen family. So that is blood family, but it's also, especially in modern culture, family is much more chosen family. So your closest friends, your closest colleagues, the people that you choose to have around you. EOL, end of life. Home funeral. It's just confusing. It's become the norm to refer to what we do at home as a home funeral, but it's confusing because people think it's the funeral service that you're having at home. And it's much more extended than that. But we'll get into defining that a bit later. So, conventional death process. This is what we've gotten used to in the 20th century, right? So most of this you'll kind of recognize. There's a terminal diagnosis, there's medical care for treatment, cure or treatment, hospice and palliative care in various different places. Immediately after death, usually within an hour, the body is moved to a funeral home. And as many of you know, just like the funeral attendants come in with their gurney, and the body gets put in a black plastic bag and moved out again. And particularly sort of going into the 21st century, there are more and more people are doing what's called direct cremation. So if the person dies at home, or the family is with them in residential care, the hospital, hospice, etc., then once the body is taken away by the funeral home, they never see it again. Embalming, which we'll I'll probably talk about a lot more later, but just a quick on it is that there is no requirement for embalming unless you are moving a body on public transport, so bus, train, plane. Otherwise, it is actually not required, even though a lot of funeral homes will tell you that the body has to be embalmed. It does not. Possible visitation or viewing of the embalmed body. A lot of funeral homes will say that they will not allow you to view the body unless it's embalmed. And each time that you have a viewing, it costs anywhere from $125 to $250. And with people flying in from different provinces and countries to be there for some kind of funeral or memorial, you're likely to need multiple viewings. The funeral ceremony, usually with a closed coffin these days. I think Catholics still have open coffins, but most other people, if there's a coffin in attendance at the service at all, it's closed. There's if it's a burial, there's a graveside ceremony, but I said that it generally includes lowering of the casket. It's actually not even that. If you, modern movies, when there's a funeral, the casket is put on a piece of artificial turf beside the grave, and the priest or the minister or whoever leads the ceremony, everybody puts a flower on the coffin and walk away. They never see the coffin go into the ground and actually be buried, which is a major lack of closure on a psychological level. And then possibly a memorial sometimes later. And it's not that common now, although I really encourage people to have a funeral very close to the time of death for the really intimate family, and have a memorial a couple of weeks or months later for the larger community. Again, just a reminder, if you have a question, put up your hand and I'll stop, okay? So for cremation, the same process, body moved shortly after death. I will say though that hospitals, hospice, residential care are getting more compassionate about this. So they're often allowing the body to stay in place for several hours so that the family, at least local family friends, can come and say goodbye. Embalming, if it's to be viewed. Cremation can only happen after 48 hours, and the reason for that is that the coroner always has to have the possibility of addressing somebody saying this is untoward situation, right? And so if the body is in ashes, they can't do anything, right? So they have that 48-hour window for the coroner to address anything. And there's usually no viewing of the body or option for final farewells with the cremation. Usually the family has no involvement in the actual cremation process, and we may get to this a little bit later, but the reality is that you do have a right, not necessarily that every crematorium will allow it, but you do have a right to witness the cremation and to actually push the button that starts the fire. And then, again, a memorial sometime later. So, a couple of important things. There is no connection between the people who served pre-death and the people who served post-death. Hospice, palliative care teams, hospices, residential care hospitals have nothing to do with the funeral industry. So whatever you were able to work out about what's important to your family, to your loved one who's dying, all of those things that you may have worked out with the nurses and the home care aides and the whatever facility the person is, none of that information gets transferred to the funeral director. Right? So there's a huge gap in the middle there. And so what ends up happening is that in a very stressful situation, and even if you're expecting the death and it's been a long time coming, when that last breath happens, there's still a state of shock. Kind of like Netherland, May not look like shock, but the psyche kind of goes into this holding position. And in that state, the family then has to explain to the funeral directors what is really important to them. And that's where the funeral industry often gets us, because we're not in the best place to be making meaningful and rational decisions. Palliative and funeral home staff are limited by their rules. So even though, I know some wonderful funeral directors, but there are certain things they're just not allowed to do by their funeral associations, which you can do at home. And the same with palliative care, right? That they're limited by the number of hours they can spend. I was just listening to a palliative care nurse talk about how she has 1 hour a week with the family, and that is not enough time to find out what's really important and meaningful to the family. So, as I said, traditionally for tens of thousands of years, we took care of our own. We washed and dressed and kept the body. We may have had clergy of some sort involved in the actual funeral service, but the whole community took care of all of those arrangements. Not a stranger. Now we've been taught to be afraid of taking care of our own dead. And we literally have been taught. Most people throughout North America have no idea that it's legal to take care of your own at home. That you do not need a funeral director or funeral home involved. And that's only happened in the 20th century. Sort of began to happen at the end of the 1900s, but mostly in the 20th century. Okay, so what is a home funeral? And I talk a lot about that because it's the one piece that we're really not familiar with. There's a number of things that we can do to support a death journey or in their family before the death. And some of those are covered by palliative care social workers or counselors, and some of them are not. But they're very similar kinds of things. And we're also used to there being some kind of service, funeral, memorial, celebration of life, right? So we're familiar with having some kind of ceremony to acknowledge the death. What we're not familiar with anymore is the home funeral, the taking care of your own at home. So spend a fair bit of time with that one. Okay, so as I said, it's not necessarily a funeral service at home, although some people do prefer to have the sort of more intimate service around the body at home. So all the post-death care, washing, dressing the body, preserving it with dry ice, or in fact there's two kinds of new ice packs that are very flexible and they freeze a lot colder, so they zap more of the heat from the body. So we try to get it down to about 4 degrees Celsius, which nobody ever tests, but you don't want the body frozen, but you want it cold enough that you're delaying any decomposition. You can use, it depends on what you're doing. If you're having cremation, if you're having burial, I guess I should say something about that right now. If it is a green burial ground, which we have in Victoria, we actually have the first one in Canada at Royal Oak, called the Woodlands. You can be buried in a coffin or a casket or a shroud. And you're actually, the family is actually allowed to lower the body into the grave and completely fill the grave, and then at the appropriate time come and plant indigenous plants on it. We recommend that people use renewable woods or recycled cardboard. If they're going to use a coffin, it says coffin here, actually the proper word is casket. Coffins is six-sided, you know those things? Casket is a rectangle. Particularly if you use the cardboard ones, one of the activities after the death, or actually before the death, doesn't really matter, is to actually decorate the casket, right? So there are some people who have actually painted gorgeous pictures on their own caskets for when they die. But it's also an incredibly good activity for people who don't want to be involved in direct body contact with the washing and dressing, for them to go and decorate the casket. It's a wonderful thing for children to get involved in, and I will tell you right now that we include children in every part of this process. We have this idea that children can't handle death. It's not true. They actually make peace with it faster than we do. Right? They find their own ways of understanding it that can be quite beautiful. So then I'll just go on with that point because I'm not sure it comes up elsewhere. One of my favorites is a little girl whose grandma died in the house. She was left in her bed, and every day the little girl would paint a picture and go and put it on grandma's chest. So after a couple of days, her parents said, "Why are you putting the painting on grandma's chest?" And she said, "Because then her heart will take it up to heaven and she'll get to see it." And she had no issue with the problem that her grandma was dead. All she was concerned about was getting her picture to her. And you can also do shrouds, which are just essentially some kind of cloth bag, right? And there's all kinds of patterns on the Sandia site that you can look at. Lying in honor or awake, etc., for the last farewells. Now, this is a really interesting thing because this is the equivalent of the visitation at the funeral home that you pay $125 to $250 for each time. If you choose, if it's your home and you choose to, you can say to all your friends, "Our door is open from 9 p.m. until 8 a.m. You are welcome to come and spend time with grandma or grandpa or whoever it is. Don't bother us during the day, we're busy." It's entirely up to what works for you and your family, right? And you're not paying anything. So there's a huge cost, and it's once again, it's the whole personalizing to what's important to that family. And again, here, everybody can be involved in some way. So, washing, dressing the body. There'll be post-death rituals or ceremonies that happen, and some of them will be planned. Maybe you'll invite some singers in to stand around the body and sing the soul off to its whatever afterlife it believes in. But sometimes it just happens spontaneously. You know, there's 2 or 3 people in the room and somebody lights a candle and there's a hush, and everybody kind of goes into this group mind space, right? And so it becomes a sacred space without really any preparation for it or anything. Another significant part of a home funeral is filing all of the paperwork. And there's a whole bunch of different paperwork. It's readily available online. Nobody knows that, but it is. And there's about 5 pieces to it all. The very first one is what's called a notification of expected death, which a doctor signs. And that actually means 2 things. One, the coroner does not need to come in because this person is expected to die. And secondly, it also means that you don't need to call a doctor or a nurse practitioner in immediately after the death to pronounce death. As long as you keep a record of the time that the last breath happened, you can wait until it's convenient for your family to have them come. So then, and there's also the process too of what do you want to do as the final ceremonies, where it's a larger community involved, maybe in a much larger building, in a church or a town hall or university building, college building, wherever is appropriate. In BC, you have to get a permit to move the body, but you actually have the right to do that, and that includes, if your loved one died in a hospital, you have the right to go to the hospital, if you have the permit, and transport the body back home, or residential care, hospice, whatever other facility that they might be in. A grave site or cremation ceremony, as I've mentioned before, that you do have, especially with a green burial ground, you have the right to participate in the process of actually burying your loved one. And some crematoriums, I'm pretty sure First Memorial allows a small group of people to witness the cremation, or at least the beginning of it, and to actually push the button. And both of those can be incredibly significant to the process of closure. And we overuse the word closure these days, but there really isn't any other word that works well for it. And of course then, after that, there's grief and bereavement support. This is really important. We have been taught that we cannot handle seeing dead bodies, and that we can't touch them because we'll get infected. Both of those are totally false. A dead body is less infectious because it isn't breathing anymore. It's not breathing out germs. If there's open sores that were infected and you were using gloves to take care of them before the death, you use gloves again after the death. Otherwise, you don't need to use gloves unless you're dealing with bladder, bowel. What's the right word? Releasing. And that does sometimes happen. Not often, but it does. And realistically, the body does not begin to bloat until days after the death. It has to go through rigor mortis and back out again, which can take anywhere from 36 to 78 hours. And if you're keeping the body cool, it won't even really, this is only tiny bits of decomposition that will happen in the usual 3 to 6 days that the body's kept at home. So, what is a death? Well, let me just stop before I go back a bit here. Is there anything that you want to ask about a home funeral before I go on to? Yes.
So you kind of touched on it, but what is there a large difference in how much it costs for like a home funeral? But I know you can do as much as you want on any funeral, but is it cheaper or more expensive generally? Do you have an idea?
I would say that using a funeral home is like this, doing a home funeral is like this. It depends on whether or not you've hired somebody, like a death midwife, to actually support you all the way through the process or not, right? But not considering that, home funeral may be $100 worth of supplies, but actually most of what you need to take care of the body you have already. Just getting this special kind of ice, and actually it's getting cheaper and cheaper and more locally available, so it's getting cheaper and cheaper. Whereas you're going to spend several $1,000s with a funeral home. Even if you have a cremation, you're going to be charged at least $1,200 to $1,500 just to make the arrangements and file the paperwork, plus the cost of the cremation. And anything else you want to add on, like an hour of visitation or something. Whereas all of that is being done by people in the family, friends, community, so none of that is being paid for in a home funeral. So it's much cheaper. And the other thing too is that it's incredibly more ecological, because you were using things that you have already used and you can use again. Whereas in a funeral home, because of the situation they're in, and I'm not criticizing, but they have to wear gowns and gloves and masks and have, paper sheets all over the body and et cetera, right? They can't reuse that kind of stuff. But when the body is at home, it's the same sheets they were sleeping in, it's the same washcloth that you were washing them with before, the same towels that you're drying them with, etc. Right? Any other questions? That was a good one. Thank you. Yes?
It seems like with a home funeral, there's a lot of, there would be a bit more planning in terms of having, like knowing that someone was about to pass away and knowing that's what you wanted. If someone were to pass away suddenly, can you still do a home funeral? Like, is there someone you can contact to help make those arrangements, kind of like you would with a hospital death?
Good question. For the most part, the people who are doing home funerals at this point, there aren't a large number, but there's more and more. They have planned ahead. And usually there's one person who is enthusiastic about the idea, and the others are going, I don't know about this. But my experience is that the people who are very edgy about it actually lose all of that fear the moment that they go hands-on. Just tell a really quick story. The last home funeral I did, there was an issue with one part of the body. And the wife had decided, it was her husband, the wife had decided that she would just witness the washing and dressing of the body. But there was this one problem. And her granddaughter said, I don't care, it doesn't bother me. And I said, fine, it doesn't bother me either. So we started dealing with it. And she came over, the wife came over, and was sort of leaning over the body. And I had a washcloth in my hand, so I just went like this. She picked up the washcloth, and I'm sure that she didn't leave one dead cell in that body. She was so thorough. Like, she just jumped from, not sure, to right in there. Right? And that's a lot what happens. However, I also have been in a situation where there was a suicide, and the person who knew me was out of the country and didn't get back for 3 days. So the body was already in the funeral home. And my role was to negotiate getting the body back to the house for a while, and to deal with the funeral celebration. So, and that's an extreme example of not immediate death, but also immediate death and 3 days having passed. I think if you know somebody who has done this before, that you can. I mean, I don't mind being called on at the last moment if something happens suddenly. So it's just, at this point, people are still learning that home funerals are possible, that there are death midwives or funeral guides who are there to help you through it. So it's just whether or not you know that that's actually available. Does that answer your question? Okay, any others? Okay. So what is a death midwife? Well, we consider ourselves primarily facilitators. It was really something important to talk with the family. We will facilitate you doing whatever you need to do all the way through the pan-death process. But it's not up to us to do it. The whole point is for the family to do it itself, right? We will step in if there's some problems, or something needs to be done right away, or it's not being done correctly, so we can show how to do it correctly. But the whole point is for the loved ones of that person who's died to be doing it. So we're facilitating that process. As I mentioned before, we focus, we don't do medicine. We have no crossover with the medical side of palliative care. On the other hand, we do have a crossover with the psychosocial, emotional, spiritual side of palliative care. And we may be able to support the family, for example, if they want to try using alternative therapies like acupuncture and stuff, like find a reputable acupuncturist or herbologist or sound therapy person, or then sort of help them find those other options for pain relief, etc. We really encourage a personalized and participatory process, right? So, you know, we're sort of always in the process of kind of pulling out, oh, that sounds like it's really meaningful to your family. Let's make sure that that gets put somewhere in this whole process, right? Helping the family to identify that and, you know, kind of dig a little deeper and find what would be really meaningful to them. And so, of course, every family is going to be different. You know, even if they're of the same faith or the same ethnic background, they're still going to be very different, especially in the very diversified world that we live in modern times. We provide a continuum of support through the whole of the pan-death process. And, you know, I know like my very first client said, you know, I can do all of this, but I wouldn't have felt comfortable doing it if I didn't know I had you to fall back on. Right? So sometimes that's the major role that we are, that we're always there to fall back on. And especially when you start getting to the paperwork and stuff, making sure that gets done in the right order, those kinds of things. When death midwifery started out back in very late 1990s, most everybody was calling themselves a death midwife, even though they didn't actually practice pan-death. And that started to shift with new designations, death doula, which is primarily pre-death, home funeral guide only deals with the home funeral celebrants, only deal with the ceremony parts. So when we started developing Cynthia, partially because I'd been a birth coach and worked with birth midwives, I felt that it was really important that if we used the term, we had to parallel a birth midwife. So we don't do the medical parts of a birth midwife, but then a birth midwife doesn't do the ceremonial parts that we do. But for the most part, there is a parallel between them, the two of them. And I don't know if I need to go through all of this. If you could just take a quick look at how close the wording is. It's just the people and the actual physical thing happening that changes.
What does CINDIA stand for again?
Canadian Integrative Network for Death Education and Alternatives. I don't believe in a bunch of letters that you can't pronounce. As well as that, Cynthia is also a girl's name that means moonlight, which is particularly appropriate. Yeah?
Sorry, I know birth midwives have a regulatory body and they require a certain level of education. Is that the same as death midwives?
No, because we are not health professionals.
Okay.
Okay, so these are some of the names that you may find. Death midwife is pan-death. Doula is